So I'll just introduce all of us right now. So I'm Dan Kaufman. I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine in the new Division of Regenerative Medicine here at UCSD, and also serve as the Director of Cell Therapy. The first speaker is going to be Claudio Brunstein, who's visiting here from University of Minnesota, where he's Associate Professor and Director of the Unrelated Donor Program in the Bone Marrow Transplant Division or program there. And then the other speaker is Sandeep Patel, who's Assistant Professor here in the Moores Cancer Center at UCSD. He's also a MD trained at, I have to get this right, at Baylor for medical degree, internal medicine at UCLA, and then fellowship at Duke. And then been here at UCSD for, I believe, about 3 years or so. And he also serves as Assistant Director of the Clinical Trials Office. So one of the goals for this session, even though I know this is the scientific symposium, I'm new here, but my understanding is there's sort of one session that's a little bit more clinically oriented. So that's what this group is going to be. We'll have sort of how these clinical applications of stem cell and gene therapy research is going forward. So just in terms of introduction, we're going to start with a quiz, and this is actually audience participation. There's sort of a motive to this question. Claudio doesn't get to answer, and I think Sandeep might have heard the answer last night as well. So this is carefully worded. The first successful allogeneic bone marrow transplant was done when and where? See if anybody. This is supposed to be a really smart audience, right? So. Any guesses? Huh? 58? That's even further back. So the answer is University of Minnesota. So it was in 1968, and this is true. And this is actually a copy of paper that I've had in my office from the Minneapolis newspaper, November 1968. Doctors, the University of Minnesota reveals first successful bone marrow transplant. This was a 7-year-old boy with a genetic immunodeficiency who got HLA-matched bone marrow from his sister. However best they could do HLA matching then was based essentially on MLR testing. This was in 1968, 48, almost, we're getting close to 50 years ago. As far as I know, David, who's the boy there, is still alive. And he's got his sister's cells functioning for 48 years. So that's the longest that we know that stem cell therapy can work. And I think that's very illuminating. And then the other part that's interesting is this is a figure from data compiled by the CIBMTR, Center for International Bone Marrow Transplant Research, on the number of bone marrow transplants done in the U.S. by year. So this doesn't even start until 1980. It's not even a blip on the graph. So it took 12 years from that first one for them to even start compiling data. And now as we go over time, if you combine autologous, using the patient's own cells, or allogeneic transplant, combined there's about 20,000 bone marrow transplants done per year in the U.S. And so this kind of shows, if you think about the other cell therapies that we've been talking about, or gene therapies, we're not even here. We're, way out over here if we're talking about, some of the things that we heard about for Parkinson's disease or for organ replacement, or other therapies that we'll be talking about. One of the other interesting, so this is the last slide from CIBMTR I'll show you, but this is the different types of donors that are used. So when this was first done, it was essentially done with HLA-matched siblings. So this was the most successful way of doing unrelated donor transplants. And then over time, this has changed. So there's now more unrelated donors being used than related donors. Cord blood is this blue line, which kind of came up in the 90s and persists. And now there's other graphs, and Dr. Brunstein is going to talk about these different types of donor sources for bone marrow transplant, how this field is evolving, and what the strengths and weaknesses are of these different types of therapies. So I think this is important as we go forward. So, you know, we've heard at this, the first couple days of the meeting and some more yet today about cell therapies for immuno-oncology. And so really there's, you know, a lot going on. There's new options for bone marrow transplant or hematopoietic cell transplant. There's obviously a lot going on in the T-cell space with TILs, tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte, which is an older technology. CAR T-cells, of course, which is rapidly developing, in other T-cell engineering or populations that can be used. I'm going to talk about natural killer cells primarily and where that's at as a field. There's other work that I don't think is going to get covered today on cancer vaccines. And then Dr. Patel is going to really talk about how we start thinking about these as combination therapies, how we can use cells and drugs together to make more effective anti-tumor choices. So with that,